detection and interception system that Iran had deployed across Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, Karaj, and western and central Iran since April the 8th. Gone. In one night. And the IDF is telling every government on earth what this means. They are not hiding it. They are saying it out loud in their own press statement. Israel's fighter jets can fly over Iran, freely, at any time, over any target, without Iranian air defenses capable of stopping them. And this morning's strikes just made that more true than it was yesterday. What you're watching is not a retaliatory exchange between two adversaries in a disputed region. You are watching the formalization of something that military historians have a specific name for. Persistent air supremacy over a sovereign nation's territory by a foreign air force without a declared war, without a UN mandate, and without any mechanism for the targeted country to restore its own defensive capability. The last time this existed in the modern era, it lasted for 12 years, and the consequences reshaped the entire strategic calculus of the region it covered. Stay with me, because the pattern I'm about to walk you through explains precisely what freedom of action in Iranian airspace means, where it leads, and why the 6 words in that IDF statement this morning are the most significant military announcement in the Middle East since the ceasefire was signed. The 4-stage pattern that governs the establishment and exploitation of air superiority over an adversary's territory is one of the most documented and most consequential patterns in modern military history. Stage 1 is the initial suppression campaign. Air defense systems are identified, targeted, and destroyed with sufficient completeness to allow regular air operations in the adversary's territory without prohibitive losses. Stage 2 is the rebuilding attempt. The adversary, having lost its air defenses, begins the long, expensive, technically demanding work of replacing radars, missile batteries, command and control systems, and interception capability. During this phase, the adversary cannot protect its territory, but believes it can restore protection given enough time and resources. Stage 3 is the suppression maintenance strike. The power that established air superiority detects the rebuilding effort and destroys the rebuilt systems before they become operational enough to threaten freedom of action. This is the critical stage because it tells the adversary not just that their air defenses were destroyed once, but that they will be destroyed every time they are rebuilt. Stage 4 is the strategic consequence. The adversary must choose between continuing a futile rebuilding cycle, changing its strategic behavior to match its new vulnerability, or finding an asymmetric response that does not depend on the air domain it can no longer contest. Every nuclear program that has been threatened by airstrikes, every proxy network that is dependent on air defense protection, every conventional military capability that requires concealment from aerial reconnaissance becomes fundamentally different after Stage 4 is established. We reached Stage 4 this morning, and to understand why that is genuinely massive, you need to understand the 3 historical cases that show exactly what this means. Historical proof number 1, August the 6th, 1990 through August the 27th, 2003. The U.S. enforced no-fly zones over Iraq. After the Gulf War of 1991, the United States, Britain, and France established no-fly zones covering northern and southern Iraq to protect Kurdish and Shia populations from Saddam Hussein's air force. Saddam had air defenses. He tried to use them. He activated radar systems, targeted coalition aircraft with surface-to-air missiles, and repeatedly challenged the no-fly zone enforcement. And every time he did, coalition aircraft destroyed the offending radar or missile battery. Within years, the pattern was established. Saddam could not fly his own planes over roughly 60% of his own country without coalition permission. He could not protect those areas from aerial observation or aerial strike. The consequences over 12 years were enormous and multi-directional. Coalition aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of sorties over Iraq with near total impunity. They observed Iraqi military movements, struck air defense systems that challenged them, and maintained the ability to strike any target in the no-fly zone at will. Saddam adapted by hiding military assets, using civilian cover, and developing asymmetric ground-based threats. But he never restored his air defense capability in the zones to a point where it threatened coalition freedom of action. When the full-scale invasion came in 2003, the coalition's pre-existing freedom of action over much of Iraq was one of the critical advantages that allowed the initial combat phase to proceed so rapidly. 12 years of sustained air superiority over Iraqi territory, maintained through exactly the suppression maintenance strike pattern that Israel executed this morning, delivered a strategic advantage whose value cannot be overstated. The lesson is not that no-fly zones always work as planned. The lesson is that once you establish persistent air superiority over an adversary's territory and destroy every rebuilding attempt, the adversary's entire strategic posture is permanently altered, whether or not a formal no-fly zone is ever declared. Israel has not declared a no-fly zone over Iran. It does not need to. The IDF's statement this morning declaring freedom of action in Iranian airspace is functionally identical in military terms. Historical proof number 2, June the 7th, 1981. Operation Opera, also known as Operation Babylon. 8 Israeli F-16 fighter jets, escorted by 6 F-15 fighters, fly over 900 kilometers to strike Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor with 16 unguided bombs. The reactor is 12 days away from becoming operational. Once it becomes operational, Israeli planners calculate that striking it would risk radioactive contamination spreading over the Iraqi population, creating an international incident severe enough to prevent Israel from completing the mission. The 12-day window is the difference between a viable strike and an impossible one. Israel strikes on day 12 of the window. Prime Minister Menachem Begin orders the strike against the explicit public opposition of the United States, which has just sold Israel the F-16 jets used in the mission. The U.S. calls the strike a violation of the terms of the arms sale. The UN Security Council unanimously condemns Israel. Every Western ally publicly criticizes the operation. And the operation works. The Iraqi nuclear program is set back by years. The principle that begin articulates in defending the strike becomes known as the begin doctrine. Israel will not allow any hostile state to acquire nuclear weapons, regardless of the diplomatic cost of preventing it, and will strike preemptively when the capability is near completion, rather than waiting for an existential threat to materialize. The Begin doctrine is not an abstract principle. It is an operational doctrine that has governed Israeli military planning for 45 years, and directly explains every strike on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure you have watched unfold since June the 13th, 2025. But here is the detail of the Osirak strike that matters most for today. The aircraft that flew that mission had to penetrate Iraqi airspace without detection to complete the strike in the window before the reactor went hot. That required years of preparation, intelligence mapping of Iraqi radar systems, and sophisticated tactics to avoid detection. Today's Israeli Air Force does not have that problem in Iranian airspace. It has freedom of action. It does not need to evade Iranian radar. It has destroyed Iranian radar. The preparation that made Osirak possible over a single sovereign strike has been transformed by Operation Roaring Lion, and now by June the 8th into a standing capability to strike any target in Iran at any time. The window that existed for 12 days over Osirak now exists permanently over the entirety of Iranian territory. That is the strategic transformation that this morning's strikes represent. Historical proof number 3, Operation Roaring Lion itself. February the 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel launched the largest joint military air operation in the history of both countries. The Israeli Air Force alone flies 200 warplanes simultaneously, striking more than 500 targets in a single operation the IDF calls the largest military flyover in the history of the Israeli Air Force. In the first 24 hours, the IDF conducts 700 sorties over Iran and deploys 540 strike waves in the first days of the operation. By March the 4th, the Israeli Air Force has used 5,000 munitions in strikes on Iran. In 4 days, 1,600 strikes are completed. The IDF's IDF international spokesperson states that over the past 24 hours alone, hundreds of Israeli Air Force fighter jets and aircraft conducted more than 300 consecutive waves of strikes. The numbers become almost incomprehensible in their scale. Over the course of the full operation, approximately 5,700 combat sorties are flown, more than 12,000 munitions are employed, approximately 3,600 in Tehran alone, roughly 8,500 strike points across Iran. And the strategic outcome, confirmed by Israeli official assessments, is that approximately 80 to 85% of Iran's air defense architecture, including radars, interceptors, and detection systems, is destroyed. The remaining 15 to 20% represents Iran's residual capability to challenge Israeli air operations. From April the 8th, the ceasefire date, Iran begins the intensive work of restoring those systems. Over 61 days, Iran deploys air defense systems in numerous areas across Iran, trying to close the gap between 85% destroyed and 0% capable. And in one night, on June the 8th, the IDF destroys those rebuilt systems too. The statement from the IDF is surgical in its precision. It says Iran has been trying to restore its detection and defense capabilities, which were degraded during Operation Roaring Lion. And it says the strike led to the destruction of these systems. Iran spent 2 months rebuilding. Israel spent 1 night unbuilding. And the IDF says the result is enhanced freedom of action in Iranian airspace. This is stage 3 of the air superiority pattern. In stage 4, the strategic consequences of permanent maintained air supremacy over Iranian territory is the thing that nobody in the mainstream is talking about this morning. Check. Verified. Undeniable. Now apply the pattern to the events of June the 8th, 2026 in full operational detail and with their complete strategic significance. Wave 1 began in the pre-dawn hours. The IDF Chief of Staff personally directed the operation from the Israeli Air Force Command Bunker. The IAF, guided by the IDF Intelligence Directorate, launched a large-scale strike on strategic defense systems belonging to the Iranian terror regime in western and central Iran. 9 Iranian air defense systems destroyed, multiple cities simultaneously targeted. The explosions heard in Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, and Karaj are not missile impacts from an exchange of fire. They are the sound of Israeli fighter jets flying over Iranian cities at will and dropping precision munitions on the rebuilt surface-to-air missile arrays that Iran deployed over the previous 2 months. Iran's Mehrabad International Airport, Tehran's main airfield, closes as a result. Not because it was struck. Because the Israeli Air Force was operating freely in the airspace above it, and no commercial or military aircraft can be safely operated in airspace, where a foreign air force is conducting active strikes. Iran's own airports close because Israel is using Iran's airspace. Let the full weight of that statement land for a moment. Iran shuts down its own airports because another country's air force is operating in Iranian airspace, and Iran cannot stop it. This is not a military exchange between 2 equal adversaries trading blows. This is a demonstration of one-sided air dominance that Iran is incapable of contesting. Wave 2 targeted energy and industrial infrastructure in southwestern Iran. The Israeli Air Force struck the Karun Petrochemical Company at the Mashar Petrochemical Complex in Khuzestan province. 2 projectiles hit the facility at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The Karun complex is one of Iran's largest ethylene producers and a critical node in the country's chemical export infrastructure. 5 production lines at the complex have now been hit since the war began on February the 28th. And here is the detail that the IDF's own statement makes explicit, and that the mainstream is missing entirely. The 2 waves were not separate operations with separate objectives. They were a single, coordinated doctrine in action. Wave 1 established the freedom of action in the airspace above the target region. Wave 2 used that freedom of action to strike the target. Air defense suppression and infrastructure strike are not sequential steps, where the first enables the second in some future operation. They are simultaneous components of the same operational logic. You destroy the defensive capability in the same operation, where you use the absence of that defensive capability to strike what you want to strike. This is the doctrine shift that the YouTube description of this strike identifies. Israel is not responding to Iranian missiles. Israel is maintaining and exploiting a state of persistent air superiority that allows it to strike any target in Iran at any moment with aircraft, precision bombs, and air-launched ballistic missiles, against which Iran currently has no meaningful defense. The IDF also struck ballistic missile storage and launch sites designed for attacks on Israel. It struck a central IRGC facility in Tehran used by the forces responsible for arming and financing Iran's regional proxies, including what the IDF describes as the hub for arming and financing the regime's terrorist proxies across the Middle East. It struck additional infrastructure at IRGC headquarters and at the IRGC Air Force Command. The scale and the targeting logic of the June 8th operation make one thing unmistakably clear. This is not retaliation in the conventional sense. Retaliation is proportional, backward-looking, and bounded. What the IDF executed on June the 8th is forward-looking, doctrine-establishing, and explicitly framed in terms of future capability rather than past grievance. The words freedom of action in Iranian airspace in the IDF's official statement are the clearest possible signal that Israel views itself as holding a standing operational license to fly over and strike targets in Iranian territory. Not when provoked, not in response to specific attacks, as a standing capability to be exercised whenever Israeli security objectives require it. Here's why this is the most strategically significant development of the entire conflict, and why it will shape the next decade of Middle Eastern geopolitics in ways that most analysts have not yet articulated. The fundamental deterrent that has protected Iranian nuclear infrastructure, Iranian military sites, and Iranian leadership from preemptive Israeli strikes for most of the last 30 years was not American diplomatic protection alone. It was distance and air defense. Israel is roughly 1,500 kilometers from the center of Iran. That distance requires aerial refueling, sophisticated flight planning, and the ability to penetrate some of the most densely layered air defense networks outside of Russia. Through the original 12-day war in June 2025, and then through Operation Roaring Lion beginning February the 28th, 2026, Israel destroyed the air defense piece of that deterrent, and this morning it destroyed Iran's attempt to rebuild it. What remains is distance, and distance in the age of the F-35 Adir stealth fighter and aerial refueling tankers is not the barrier it once was. Israeli pilots flew F-35 jets over Tehran for 2.5 continuous hours during Operation Roaring Lion. The aircraft, the F-35, replaced as the IAF's primary deep penetration platform, had to carefully avoid detection. The F-35 does not need to avoid detection. It is designed to be undetectable to the systems Iran has. And now Iran's rebuilt systems are gone again. The air defense deterrent to Israeli strikes on any target in Iran is, as of this morning, at its lowest point since the ceasefire. This matters most for 4 specific categories of targets that are now exposed to Israeli air power in a way they have never been before. First, nuclear facilities. Iran's remaining nuclear infrastructure, including any reconstruction work done on facilities degraded during the earlier operations, is now reachable by Israeli aircraft with no meaningful air defense protection. The Washington Institute's analysis confirms that Iran adapted during the conflict by shifting to more concealed and protected launch infrastructure. That concealment is far more difficult to maintain when an adversary's air force is operating freely over your territory with drones that provide around-the-clock intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Second, ballistic missile production. The IDF struck ballistic missile storage and launch sites this morning. Iran's ability to reconstitute its ballistic missile capability, which was substantially degraded during Operation Roaring Lion, is directly proportional to its ability to protect production and storage sites from aerial observation and strike. With freedom of action in Iranian airspace, Israel can observe and strike those sites whenever it identifies reconstruction activity. Third, the proxy supply chain. The IRGC's central hub for arming Hezbollah, Houthi, and other proxy forces in the region, which was targeted this morning, is the node through which Iran's influence in the wider Middle East is projected. Degrading that hub repeatedly using standing air superiority is the mechanism by which Israel is trying to permanently reduce Iran's capacity to threaten Israel through proxies, even if Iran agrees to nuclear constraints. Fourth, and most significant for the nuclear deal negotiations, command and control. Every strike on IRGC headquarters, IRGC Air Force Command, and leadership facilities is a strike on the decision-making architecture that governs whether Iran can credibly threaten Israel in any domain. A regime that cannot protect its decision-makers from aerial assassination from 1,500 kilometers away is a regime whose deterrent capability against the country doing the assassinating is fundamentally compromised. Now, let us address the 3 things that defenders of the current strategic status quo will argue and why they are wrong. The first argument is that Iran will adapt, and that the rebuilding cycle will eventually produce systems that can challenge Israeli freedom of action. The Washington Institute confirmed this in its analysis. Iran adapted quickly once U.S. and Israeli forces gained broad freedom of action over its airspace, shifting from larger, more visible launch architecture to more concealed and protected methods. This is true. Iran is learning. Iran is adapting. But the adaptation argument assumes a ceiling on Israeli strike capability and intelligence penetration that does not currently exist. The IDF struck buildings in which IRGC commanders were present during Operation Roaring Lion. It flew drones over Tehran in daylight. It targeted trucks carrying weapons and surface-to-air missile launchers while they were moving, striking them before they reached their deployment positions. The intelligence architecture that guides this level of precision is not degraded by Iranian concealment tactics. When the aircraft conducting reconnaissance over Iran are F-35s, operating in an airspace where Iran's radars have been destroyed. Every time Iran deploys a rebuilt system, Israel detects it and destroys it. The adaptation cycle favors the side with better intelligence and faster strike capability. That is currently Israel. The second argument is that Iran will respond asymmetrically in ways that negate Israeli air superiority's strategic value. The Houthi maritime blockade is an example. The IRGC's threat to all regional energy targets is an example. Iranian proxy networks in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are examples. These asymmetric responses are real, and they impose real costs. But they do not negate air superiority over Iran itself. They are a response to the pain of air superiority, not a solution to it. Iran's Strait of Hormuz leverage is meaningful, but Iran's willingness to permanently close Hormuz and trigger a global economic crisis that falls on Iran's own economy, at least as much as on its adversaries, is constrained by Iran's own survival calculus. Asymmetric responses are pressure tools, not deterrents, to the specific capability that air superiority represents. They can raise the cost of maintaining air superiority. They cannot eliminate the capability itself. The third argument is that the nuclear deal will produce a framework that makes air superiority over Iran irrelevant, because Iran will agree to nuclear constraints in exchange for sanctions, relief, and security guarantees. This is the argument that Trump is making when he says the Iran conflict will not affect the peace talks. And it is partially correct that a deal remains possible. But the June 8th strikes have altered the deal's parameters in a specific and important way. Iran is now negotiating under conditions of demonstrated Israeli freedom of action over its territory. Every Iranian negotiator in every future session knows that their country's rebuilt air defenses were destroyed in one night, and that Israel has declared its right to maintain that destruction indefinitely. The deal's value to Iran, specifically the security guarantee component, must now account for the fact that American diplomatic protection of the deal does not prevent Israeli aircraft from operating freely over Iranian territory whenever Israel determines that Iranian activity violates the deal's terms or threatens Israeli security. This is not a theoretical future concern. It is a current operational reality that changes the deal's risk calculus for every Iranian decision-maker at the table. Here is the single thing that the 6 words in the IDF statement this morning reveal that nothing else in the news cycle captures. Freedom of action. In Iranian airspace is not a military status report. It is a political declaration. It is Israel telling Iran, telling Washington, telling every Gulf state watching this conflict, and telling the world that the new strategic reality of the Middle East is this. The country that established air superiority over Iran, and has now formally declared it, intends to maintain that superiority as a permanent operational condition, is not going away after a deal is signed. The deal does not end freedom of action. The deal does not restore Iranian radar. The deal does not prevent Israeli jets from returning to Iranian airspace the moment Israel determines the deal's terms have been violated or Iranian capabilities have been restored to a threatening level. What Israel's fighter jets did this morning was not just strike 9 air defense systems and 1 petrochemical complex. They filed notice. A notice that says the strategic environment in which any Iran deal will be implemented is one where Israel retains the ability to enforce compliance through air power at any moment without prior authorization from Washington. That is a new element in the Middle East's strategic architecture that did not exist before Operation Roaring Lion. And this morning it was made permanent. Subscribe, because I am tracking every development in this air superiority campaign with sourced, verified, same-day analysis, telling you what the military moves mean for the diplomatic track, for oil markets, and for the balance of power in the region before the mainstream connects the dots. Watch the next video because the specific question of what Iran can still do with no functional air defense architecture and a declared Israeli freedom of